Hey listeners, Mike here. Quick introduction for this week's episode. It is the second half of our Frankenstein episode. If you haven't already, make sure you go back and listen to part 1, where we discuss our love for the Universal monsters, in particular our love for Frankenstein and when we were first introduced to those early black and white monster movies and what they mean to us today. And then after that, Brian and I go pretty deep into what it took to get Frankenstein to go from page to screen. It's a really fun discussion. We go right into the background of everything, as only the Pod and the Pendulum can. So if you haven't already, make sure you listen to part 1. But without any further ado, here is the second half of that episode with Garrett, Brian, Devaughn, and myself. So hope you enjoy it, and hope you enjoy this whole series on the Universal Frankenstein films. All right, now that we've talked a little bit about how Frankenstein got made, let's talk a little bit about the movie itself, what we see on screen. And I kind of want to open the discussion with something we talked a little bit about when we were talking about our initial thoughts. That brief time between Dracula and Frankenstein, how much of a leap there had been made between the way the pictures look. And how I kind of mentioned with Dracula, it looks like it's a silent picture. And it looked like a stage production, which it was. Like Dracula, the movie was adapted from the stage production. With Frankenstein, there's this much greater sense of scale. There's a much larger variety of the sets. I think there's a lot. Whale does a much better job of capturing like a much more dynamic motion picture here. Mm-hmm. Going back to the opening scene itself, and Devaughn, you were talking about this, that sense of like light and dark, the shadows that are cast in that graveyard, like going back to like really pulling from German expressionism and bringing that to like American cinema, and how Whale was able to capture that.
Yeah, I mean, there was even like a difference in when people were consuming film at this time, versus before, when, with the kind of looks of like kind of showing people that like, this is like introducing the idea of like cinema transporting you like into a world. So it's like it does feel like, a lot of films beforehand did kind of look like plays, that were filmed, versus this does feel a little bit more cinematic. And even like the little introduction at the beginning kind of sets the table for that a little bit in an interesting way of it's like kind of like a transition thing. Like people are used to the stage, so you like kind of give them that a little bit, but then like kind of the way that it presents that, like, okay, what you're about to watch, you are watching a movie, you're going into this different world with these characters versus, what they're traditionally used to.
And I think a lot of that world building element had happened during the silent era. So you have, sort of a lot of big fantasies and things like that. So that happened. What shackled it back down to being more stage bound was sound, frankly. The sound era at its beginnings was rough. There are very few great movies of the early sound era between 1927 and 1931 because they were just so locked down to microphone placement. Recording was pretty young. But even the year 1931 itself I find really interesting because I usually use a couple of examples. I use Dracula and Frankenstein, just looking at the difference between the way the two films are staged and look and are shot. The scenes with camera movement in Dracula are almost all silent, whereas the dialogue scenes are very stagey with stationary camera. Frankenstein, you have a lot of layered sound, like you can hear the wedding bells ringing when the toast is being given, with the servants and stuff, for example. Another example in another genre would be the gangster genre. You have Little Caesar and The Public Enemy released in the same year, and it's the same deal. Little Caesar is a good movie, but it looks really stagey by comparison to The Public Enemy that's got, just especially in the soundtrack, is really, really dynamic. And it's so, Bill Wellman was being so, almost seems to be so experimental that he's kind of showing off a little bit in that movie. But it's fun. It's a cool movie. I really like. But I think those are an apt comparison because they both came from 1930. All four of those films came from 1931, and the earlier ones have sort of a similar feel, and the later ones have sort of a similar thing going on too.
So Brian, were there like any innovations in 31 that allowed for these like giant leaps forward in being able to adapt these stories and to make them look and feel more like movies as we would recognize them? Or was it just a matter of getting sea legs under them? Because I know like part of the difficulty, like transitioning to talking pictures, was like just like the major actors of the day weren't used to talking on screen, and like they weren't suited for it. So a lot of them transitioned out of acting because they weren't suited for talking film. Was it just a matter of getting sea legs under them? Or
I think that was part of it for sure. You have just thinking of also just innovations in sound recording, like also William Wellman invented the boom mic essentially. And that was an important thing to, just putting a mic on a broomstick or a fishing pole and putting it over the actors' heads, was this huge innovation. For example, you didn't have to sit around and talk to a mic. You could have someone just off screen, just out of range, getting the sound in there. So I think that adds to the ability for there to be more camera dynamism as well. And also I think that you have a great director who's willing to work to solve the problems. I think that Todd Browning is a good director and a capable director. I think his heart was not in Dracula. And there are reasons for that. He had just lost a dear friend in the death of Lon Chaney Sr. And I think that you look at some of his earlier movies, they're very energetic, very dynamic, but that one is just not. Though I like Dracula. I'm not trying to shit on Dracula because I do like that movie a lot, but I don't think that he had the same fire that Whale did in making this movie.
And Wales, we talked about, didn't come to this picture necessarily wanting to do it. Like he kind of had to be strong-armed into it and then fell in love with it a bit as he got creative freedom to do what he wanted to do and make it the way he wanted to make it. That's Garrett, you were talking before about like the timeless feel of this movie and making it feel like a fairy tale. And I think that's like really appropriate. And I think about this like opening scene in particular, like when you're in that graveyard and you have this like gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous set piece, but it's so hard to pin down exactly not only like where this movie takes place. Like you get this like vague idea that it's somewhere in Eastern Europe, like either Germany or Austria, but also like when this movie takes place, because like, they do look like peasants, yet you have like Colin Clive and Henry and Victor in Waldman wearing very modern clothes, and you have like a modern university, and yet everybody else looks like they're lifted straight out of like Andersen's fairy tales, like they've been airlifted in. Yep. How do you think that kind of adds to like the atmosphere here and the timelessness of this film?
I mean, it's really twofold because it's not just the atmosphere, it's also the text of the film. It's what the film's trying to communicate about class. I think it's really wise to have such a vivid disparity between class and having those who are, more well-to-do in these more modern kind of contemporary clothes for the time. Meanwhile, everybody else again looks like they just hopped out of the DeLorean, from the 1600s. There's such a disparity between the two that I also do feel exactly what you were talking about kind of gives it this sort of out of time, sort of dreamlike quality. And that opening sequence that you were talking about is like sort of the opening sequence, there's also a prologue too, to where like a warning is given to the audience, which I think is such a vibe. That's so great.
Love that.
That actor also appears later in the film as like the scientist. So I love that he shows up to kind of give everybody a fair warning to, you know, exit if they'd like to. It's almost like a Haunted Mansion style. It's fantastic. But
that was actually a pairing, just if you don't mind me jumping in, that was actually a pairing to go with the ending of Dracula.
Yes.
Yeah, so you've heard this. Okay, so Edward Van Sloan plays Van Helsing, and at the end of Dracula, there was a epilogue that was recorded where he says, you know, don't worry, we've shown you these things, but hey, they aren't real. But then he kind of winks and goes, but are they? You know, and so this was sort of like, but that footage unfortunately is lost. But this opening is very much that idea, and that has been parodied to death too. I mean, the first
Simpsons.
the first like 4 seasons of the Treehouse of Horror start with that. So there's all kinds of things that do that. Yeah, it's great.
But think of like your man Wes Craven talking in Last House on the Left, saying like, tell yourself it's only a movie.
Right.
It's only a movie. And that's exactly
Same thing. Yeah.
where this tradition comes from. Like it's Edward Van Sloan coming out and telling the audience, it's only a movie, folks. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Don't worry about it.
Well, I will also say I think it even predates that a little bit and kind of goes to the exact type of storytelling that would create something like Frankenstein the novel. Like Mary Shelley wrote that out of kind of her sharing scary stories with friends, and it literally like she thought of one that was so scary she couldn't go to bed, you know, and then eventually ended up writing this book. So I think it's also kind of this gather around the fire, like let me tell you a scary story, which again kind of adds to the timelessness of it, right? Like that verbal storytelling.
I love that's also not like bullshit though, because I mean, you know, I think it is fair to give people in the 30s a warning, like, hey, if you don't like dead kids, this one might not be for you. They're kind of ahead of the curve on like, does the dog die?
If you like dead kids, though, boy, do we have the movie for you.
Well, they wouldn't have seen though. If they in the 30s, they would not have seen Maria. I think the preview audience would have, but that scene was cut from the film, and then it wasn't until not until like the DVD release, maybe that it was like, so it was thought lost.
There was a restored version that came out in the 90s on VHS that I owned.
Okay,
but that was the first one where the scene where she actually goes into the water, that was the first time that was seen in 60 years at that point. So it was still missing some of the other dialogue, but it had that.
Well, I take it back. Audiences in 30s were wimps. I take it back.
But to your point, though, you're seeing like hung bodies and hunchbacks cutting them down and like brains being scooped out. Like you're seeing some wild shit in the 30s that you're not typically getting in movies. Well, and then
beyond like the kind of the gratuitous violence of it all, which I would say, even though they're in the same year, I would say is certainly more than Dracula. I do think the film also is just covering these more taboo topics, right? The one of the main characters in the film says, "I know what it feels like to be God," which is also like a very controversial line as well. So yeah, I think that this movie is, route with scandalousness, like on both sides, literal and more like kind of a metaphorical sense.
We'll definitely talk about that as we talk more about our main man, kind of Henry, and one of the main conflicts of this movie. But I do love that you do have like Edward Van Sloan coming out to this to like kind of give the audience a little pat on the back and let them know everything is going to be okay, and hold almost like a precursor to content warnings, a little trigger warning before. So this is not a new thing.
And then the scene following this, that graveyard scene that you were mentioning, I really like too. It establishes this great visual language for the film. If you look, there's not a lot of straight lines in that scene. Everything is kind of at a slant, which is such an expressionist style with these dark shadows and these very stark contrasts between light and dark. And one of my favorite details is Dr. Frankenstein is when he's shoveling the dirt out of the grave, he's throwing it in Death's face, which is like the statue right behind him. So I think that film, that opening scene sets the tone for this film. It establishes a visual language. It kind of establishes one of the main sort of character arcs, you know, with Dr. Frankenstein, as well as giving it this sort of gather around the fire, I'm about to tell you a scary story sort of feeling. All within 2 minutes, 3 minutes?
and not only setting the tone for this film, but again, this is like James Whale kind of setting the tone for Universal, you know, features going forward. Because I mean, for my money, between this, I absolutely love the Invisible Man and him bringing in you know, the effects angles and stuff, and then Bride of Frankenstein. I think he kind of has some of the most distinct directorial personality that he brings to these films, and like this one in particular, with like you said, like the way that he frames certain things, and like a lot of you know, long camera movements, which wasn't, you know, super common back in the day either. Like James Whale just had that sauce.
Whale goes on a run between this, the Old Dark House.
Old Dark House is so great, man. It's so great. We've talked about it a couple of times on the podcast. It's appeared in my movie math at least twice.
Before there was James Wan, there was James Whale.
Ain't that the truth?
And folks, that is a t-shirt idea that I think we need to do. All right. That is something that we need to do. We need to will that into the universe.
We're going to start selling merch here. Yeah.
I think we could do that. I think we could make that work. Here's one of the things I love about this movie. And it's a lot of it just boils down to how Karlof portrays the monster. This is really a movie that doesn't have, it's a horror movie that doesn't have a villain. That there are no real quote unquote bad guys or villains in this movie. The closest you could argue would be Fritz. Poor dear Fritz, who is a bit of a sadist. I mean, fair to say.
Poor dear Fritz, he's an asshole.
I know. He's disabled. He's got something, probably not getting the best treatment. You know, he's got some issues to work out, and he's just taking it out on the wrong guy. So, you know, I mean, I think if there was therapy for Fritz back then, maybe he would have had a better outcome, is what I'm saying. But I think this is a movie that doesn't have like a true villain. Like Karlof as the monster is not a villain, but neither is Henry Frankenstein. Like, Henry Frankenstein is not your typical mad scientist. He's certainly not what Peter Cushing would become in the Hammer Frankenstein movies, who's a straight-up psychopath that goes around, like, murdering people and setting up murders, and is amazing in those movies. But this is just like a very sad movie all around. I think, Garrett, you put it really well in some of like your notes here. The real, like, villain of this movie is, like, shitty parenthood, like not being able to own up to your mistakes, not taking ownership for your actions, and kind of like trying to pass the buck.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. It really just comes down to Harloff's performance. It hinges on that, the sympathy he's able to have for his eyes, as well as the terror that he's able to imbue with his physicality and his enormous hands and feet, which I think is such a great detail. His introduction in this film has got to be one of the most iconic in all of cinema, right? That turn to the camera with that shadow on him. That's iconic right there. Certainly one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. But yeah, I think that this movie, it's about a deadbeat dad, man. It's about a deadbeat dad who's not really around and creates this thing just because he can. Right, he doesn't really have the responsibility and the kind of wherewithal to want to take care of the thing. He's opened Pandora's box mostly based on ego, and that is kind of the end of it. And I will disagree. I do think that this film does have a clear villain. It maybe isn't this Machiavellian, mustache twirling bad guy, but it's society, right? It's those who are in power, those who are making these decisions, and those who are kind of affecting everyone below them. I think it's really apt, and I think somebody put it in the notes here that Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster and how many times are we going to do that this episode? Let's call it Frankenstein. Start a tally.
Let's say this, listeners. we're probably going to interchangeably call the monster Frankenstein, the monster, and Frankenstein's monster. Do not come at us.
We know.
These are long
Come
episodes. We know, and you're getting this entertainment for free. So give us a breather.
Make a drinking game out of it if you
go.
If you need to.
Have some fun.
That'll keep you happy.
Turn some fun into it. But yeah, the monster having this look that is of the working class, I think realistically it was probably Dr. Frankenstein had a suit in his closet he doesn't wear anymore, and he threw it on the monster. But this ill-fitting, dirty, kind of lumbering man, I don't think kind of looks upper class. I think he looks kind of lesser than, and I think that this film is a lot about taking care of those kind of below you, whether it is this kind of parental relationship or in the eyes of societal kind of relationships. There's a lot going on in the film that is quite different than the book. I think that this movie goes in a really different thematic direction. My one complaint, and it is genuinely my one, I think that this movie kind of soils all of that, because the film starts off with this weird eugenics sort of angle with the bad brain, good brain. Kind of removes the sense of morality out of the film. It really kind of undercuts its argument there, because it does seem like it's firmly arguing on the side of nature, not nurture, where I think the rest of the film is communicating nurture. It's a weird dissonance of a moment.
It's
there.
a carryover from
yes,
it's a
the history.
It's a carryover from the Garrett Fort Robert Flory script. It's probably there to appease the censors. I know that the Hays Code was not enforced, but it did exist, and they needed to get approval, and villains or characters like this had to have certain motivations or reasons. But I think Whale does a great job sort of saying, okay, forget about that.
Yeah, because like Clive's Victor gives a look when that happens. Like, okay, like it doesn't really matter.
It's
like,
just
when
dead
he finds
tissue
out,
is what he
it's
says.
just dead tissue.
I mean, I think the film still gets to have it a little bit of both ways to like kind of make still have the argument of it being truly, nature versus nurture, when I think he is, vastly more interested in the nurture part. And I think that's kind of what comes through in the way that, society can, not only shape, a person, whether it be, the monster not being exposed to other people and, the outside world and kind of learning things. And that's like kind of what made, Poor Things so special, because it's like, oh, this is what would have happened if, the monster got to take a little vacation and learn some things, so it's like, it's kind of that, but then it's also society weighing on Henry, because it kind of gives him these insecurities and like this kind of expectation to, like, as he kind of keeps talking up this ultimate thing he's gonna do, he's also in the back of his brain like, I still also got to pull it off. I got to do it. And then when the monster doesn't turn out the way he wants it to be, then, he kind of starts backtracking on some of his own ideologies and things like that. So it's like you still get to kind of have it a little bit both ways. Like throughout the past year, two like themes that like kind of stood out in a lot of movies that I really loved are ones that explore, that accountability of like kind of where does the never-ending chain start of, is it this person's fault, or is it this event's fault, or is it this? And also like, kind of personal autonomy of like kind of being able to grow into your own person by your own ways, versus the way that others kind of dictate the environment for you.
It's a carryover from the novel in that, like, in the novel, when Victor lays eyes on the monster, he immediately disowns him. He runs away from it and abandons the creature.
Gotta go
right
get
away.
some cigarettes from the gas station.
Exactly. It's like I tell the joke, and this did not happen in my real life. Like, yeah, like, one day my dad played hide and seek with me, and 20 years later we found him in California. Like, that did not happen, but I love that joke. That's kind of what Victor Frankenstein does in the novel. And here, like, Henry, he's so consumed with this idea of like, can I do this? Can I create life from the dead? Can I play God? He never asked the question like, well, what would I do after that? what would I do? Like, once I create life, what is my moral and ethical responsibility to this human, to this being, once I do that? Because he has no interest in being a parent. He's interested in creating.
Yeah, and I think that this story, too, is really a good example of the timelessness of stories, again, being passed down and altered throughout history. And I think one example of this, and I'm not drawing anything unique, it's literally the title of the book, but this being kind of a parallel between the story of the monster and Prometheus, or Adam in the Garden of Eden. Pick one about the person who kind of chased this enlightenment or this wisdom, obtain it, and then now what? Now that you've opened it, what are you going to do? We just saw this story again a couple of times this year with Poor Things and Oppenheimer, both of which have a lot of parallels with Frankenstein and Prometheus, of course. Again, Oppenheimer and Prometheus, not saying anything new here. It's literally in the title of the book. But it stands to reason that there is a reason that we're still talking about this film nearly 100 years later, and it's about the timelessness of these stories that have been passed on throughout generations.
Yeah. I think
Brian,
what you're...
I saw your... Oops, sorry. You were going to just jump in, so jump in.
Yeah, what Garrett's saying about the deadbeat dad thing, I think that's so well set up in that first encounter with the monster. The first time the monster shows up and Frankenstein opens the light for him to see, and the monster's reaching up for it, and he's like getting agitated and desperate to reach it. And then he just closes the light off again and then the monster just kind of reaches out for him, with those great hand gestures that he does.
Yes. Yeah.
And he's so helpless, like he just wants affection, he wants direction, he wants something. Mm-hmm. And he says, and then, what happens immediately, Fritz comes in. Fritz is powerless. He's a caste below everyone except for the monster. He can agitate the monster. And then, my gosh, he ends that scene by telling Fritz to leave it alone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
leave it alone. And he doesn't leave it alone out of any sense of sympathy for the monster, but out of aggravation that the monster can't do more.
Yeah.
That he's almost like he's upset that the monster is so simple.
And he turns his face away from it.
Brian, that scene that you were mentioning, I think, is also a good example of this film using the idea of light in really fascinating ways. Light and fire and lightning kind of interchangeably. I love that scene, that great shot of his hands kind of reaching at the light coming down from the moon, and then Fritz comes in with the torch and scares him away, kind of establishing early on that what will eventually kill him in quotes, but also kind of the duality, right? Enlightenment, fire, enlightenment as an example of enlightenment. It can be good light. It can be it can illuminate a room, and it can allow somebody to create, or it can destroy as well. And I think it's drawing a parallel between that and people. People can create, but people can also destroy.
Right.
And our empathies so quickly turn to the monster in that scene. He's been on screen for a minute and a half, and then we're like, oh, we're on his side. And a lot of that has to do with Karlof, I think.
And you contrast that with our introduction to him, and I think you mentioned, Devaughn, like that opening shot we get of him when he backs into the room, and you have no reason for him to back into the room. It's a kind of an odd way to introduce him, but to have him turn around, and then you get those 3 quick cuts, and you get those 3 quick cuts in order to frighten the audience, because you like pull in super tight on Karlof's face and that wonderful makeup, and what makes it work is like that heavily lidded gaze, and like audiences have never seen anything like this. And I still think that like Pierce's makeup for Frankenstein is like the greatest makeup job for any movie monster ever, like almost 100 years later, because it allows for like, unlike say like I always love the Jason Voorhees reveal at the end of a Friday the 13th, but it doesn't necessarily allow for a performance under there. It's just like really cool monster makeup. Karlof is allowed to give a real performance under like a really cool makeup job.
And so much of it is just expanding and building upon his face. I mean, it's just exaggerating certain features. And that's why it's so, and that's why I don't think anyone else quite pulled it off as well.
Yeah.
Either, you know.
Not too many people got a face like that. Not too many people got a face like him. I mean, and even under all the makeup, he's still a good-looking chap. Not gonna lie, the monster still would. I can make a case for him.
He could get it.
I think his physicality that he brings to it as well is really key in humanizing him, because I think it would be easy for him to be just a robot, you know, just kind of walk like RoboCop in a way. But I think what he's able to do is make it feel human, right? Allowing us as an audience to engage with it. And what a great way to introduce us to that character, as you were saying, than just immediately, you know, crash to his eyes and seeing the you know, kind of the window to his soul, so to speak. Not to get too corny, but you know, it's all there.
It is what gets a little disappointing as you start to get to like Ghost of Frankenstein and House of Frankenstein, is that the monster literally he kind of just becomes a minion. That it's like Igor or a mad scientist just basically points the monster in a direction and says like Hulk smash, and that's what the monster does.
But in a way, that's kind of poetic too, isn't it? Right? That's what he became. This thing that was initially sympathetic has been hammered into submission. Right. Like, it's kind of pessimistic, but ain't that the truth?
I guess, but I think what you get here in this first movie, and especially when we get to Bride, is so much more nuanced and wonderful. And even like Son of, to a lesser extent, like by Son of, like Karlof is kind of like, over this a little bit. I think the thing with the monster is he's only violent against others as retaliation. Like when they strike out against him. Like Fritz is like really sadistic in his treatment of the monster, as we've said. And that's why he suffers that fate. Like that's why Karloff's monster strikes out against him. We talked about the criminal brain. The monster's also always learning. When Waldman and Henry lie in wait for him, when they open the door to his prison cell, he doesn't come lumbering out and try to escape. He stops and he looks around. He knows that, like, this is a little too easy. Like, why would I be able to get out so easily? And then later, after he kills Waldman and he's trying to make his way out of the castle, he sees that door and he recognizes it as like the door that kept him imprisoned earlier. And he immediately kind of makes like a disapproving gesture towards it and makes his way to another door. Like the monster is very quickly learning. And I think that's one of the things that I kind of like love about this Karlof, is his monster evolves throughout this movie.
And you see that in his physical performance as well, because I mean, like, you know, obviously like when he's introduced, like kind of hobbling around, which iconography there too. I mean, who as a kid has not, you know, done a stiff Frankenstein walk at some point, but even throughout the film though, he does, you know, gain a little bit more athleticism. I mean, he's able to outrun a mob and climb up windmills by the end of the movie, you know, after, you know, when we're introduced to him, he can like barely, you know, walk to a chair. So it's like he does still loosen up his like kind of physicality to a degree as well, to like kind of show, you know, that evolution he's having.
Even though he does change in the film, it's a real far cry from how much he changes in the book, because in the book he becomes this very eloquent, you know, there are chapters of monologues that he's giving. He's very thoughtful. Again, I just want to keep talking about Poor Things, but again, that was like something that Poor Things did, is like showing this person become a real person, not just this, you know, thing that can climb up a windmill pretty fast. That's pretty good, huh? No, it's like, I think, you know, a thoughtful person with real thoughts and feelings, whereas this is still, you know, I'm kind of the monster. What it makes me think of is, you know, kind of like an attack dog. It's you know, in this environment you had this negligent owner that didn't keep his dangerous dog on a leash and, you know, kind of give it the love and attention that it deserves in order to kind of shape it into being a respectable human. He doesn't understand or have the responsibility of this power that he wields, and again, like the Prometheus story, it gets out of control and they blame the monster for that rather than Dr. Frankenstein.
I think of a toddler more than an attack dog. I think of like, this is a newborn. Sure. Except, you know, we don't see Karloff's monster as a newborn. We see him as a grown man, because that's what he appears to be. And it's interesting because like Henry is saying, I've created this new being out of the parts of dead beings. And I wonder, because he didn't create this brain from scratch. Like, he took an old brain. The brain is where our memories live. Like, is one of the brain is like think of the brain as like having millions of treasure chests in them, and those treasure chests can unlock like every memory that we've ever had. And would that be the case for like formerly dead tissue that's now been reanimated? Like, is this actually a new creature or a new person that is newly alive, or is this actually like a really what we would think of as a ghoul or a zombie, like a reanimated dead person?
The way I think about it is with the way that he was reanimated with the lightning strike and everything. It's like reformatting an SD card for a camera, So it's still not a new, it's not a new card, but however, it's kind of given this kind of fresh start in a way. And so it's like, but I don't think Henry understands that, because he's kind of expecting this creation to come out and be, oh, you should be at your age appropriate level of behavior. Otherwise you're a failure, versus kind of looking at it as, like you said, like a toddler. It's like, hey, people don't learn things unless you teach it to them. So it's like, that little girl's death might not have happened if you taught, the monster what water was. Did you think about that, Henry?
I think I prefer the film to be about as opaque as it is about how exactly this works. I think it's the perfect blend of science fiction, but again, that fairy tale. There's lightning and sparks, and it came from the sky. So I don't want it to get too down into the nitty gritty. I do think that there is an appealing science to it all, kind of this mad scientist, almost magic potion, so to speak. But I don't want the film to get bogged down in details, which I don't think that it does. It's a great blend of fantasy, a little potentially supernatural, but kind of based in this or rooted in science.
And Brian, that's something that you had written about.
Yeah.
You had written about how you had to believe that this could appear. The science doesn't have to be something that we know about or is even potentially possible, but it had to make audience believe that at least for a moment we could buy into this in order for us to believe the story. Well, it couldn't be magic.
Right. I think it's telling that in this version, the monster is given life through electricity, a scientific manner, whereas stuff before this, Caligari's not Frankenstein, it's hypnosis in that, but like the Golem, for example, it's a scroll that has a sort of a awakening powers of this clay figure, and then in Metropolis, there's definitely like alchemy involved. There's some sort of black magic involved in the robot Maria turning into the woman. In the Edison Frankenstein, he's put together in a cauldron. I mean, it's all very magic, potion, alchemy, that sort of stuff. Here, and the plays as well. The first version of the script, the Garrett Ford, Robert Florey script, was a magic elixir that brought him to life. Here, it's changed. It's lightning, and I think they're harnessing the lightning, the way that scientist Benjamin Franklin did, gives it sort of a plausibility, I think. Especially, you don't have to know the nitty gritty of the science. Obviously, it's a stretch. It's an extrapolation. But, there had been all those things about, frog legs that have been galvanized and they move on their own because of electricity and things like that. Or, there's sort of those kinds of things in the mixture that make it feel that. So when Whale is like, okay, if they can believe this, if they can believe the laboratory sequence with the lightning brought this thing to life, then we're good. If the audience doesn't believe that could be real, then what's really the point? And so I like that there's extended realism to this.
Well, it also feels a little biblical too, doesn't
Yeah.
it? Like kind of a little like burning bush sort of energy that it seems like, again, after this he says, "I'm God." So like it's not exactly subtext here, but it does seem like the hands of God are kind of coming down from the sky and, breathing life into this creature.
And then God rejects the creature, rejects his creation too. I mean, we could really go down that rabbit hole there.
And that line, "Oh, in the name of God, now I know what it
feels
like to be God." That was, again, removed from the original print of the film.
Actually, I don't want to. My understanding is it was because when it was originally released, it was pre-code. It went through. But for the re-release in 1938, it was removed and thought lost, and it was a jump cut for decades after that. The restored version restored that, but they didn't have the sound for a long time. So eventually, they found the sound disc and were able to put the sound of him saying that line back in. When I was a kid, the tape I watched over and over again, it was just a crash of thunder during that line.
Right.
So, and there's actually I didn't notice it until this viewing today. There is looks like an exchange between Fritz and Frankenstein that's lost as well. And I don't know what they say, but they're
just
trying
to pull him away from the table.
Yeah. But I'm not really. So I wonder if there's some lost dialogue
more to that scene.
Too. Yeah.
I wanted to get your guys' kind of interpretation of Fritz as a character, notably a character that is, or were you gonna? Is that planned for later?
Before we do that, because I want to focus a little bit on Victor, and specifically this side of him, this idea of wanting. But I do want to talk about Fritz for sure, because he's fascinating, and he's he becomes the prototype for a very specific type of side character, supporting character we're going to see. But Henry Frankenstein, he's a very specific type of scientist we're going to see throughout these movies and throughout horror films, and he kind of becomes adapted into more of a mad scientist later on. This idea of I know what it feels like to be God, and the idea that is removed later on because it's deemed sacrilegious. I find that odd, because it's becoming from the point of view of the person who's eventually going to get his comeuppance in the end. At the end, he is punished in a sort of way for his creation. He's tossed from, I guess, he does survive at the end of this movie because sequel.
In the original cut, he died.
In the original cut, he's dead. And then they decide, we got to make... So, and again, Frankenstein is a precursor to so much of what we see in horror when they're wait a minute, we can make more of these. Even Dracula doesn't get a true sequel for years, really. You get the daughter of Dracula, or Dracula's daughter, but just not really a sequel. Bella's not in it.
I mean,
it's kind of odd that that line would get removed, because your quote unquote bad guy or villain gets a comeuppance for it. We're supposed to be against him. He's going to pay a price for feeling like he is on par with God for creating this and tempting fate.
I think there's an interesting kind of duology with the science versus faith that they kind of do, which, I mean, yeah, he is kind of the template for a mad scientist, but at the same time, he isn't really that in this one. Though he is kind of deeply egotistical, he's also deeply insecure at the same time, to where he's kind of, talks a lot of this talk, but also is kind of worried about, what people's impressions are going to be. And I think, the science angle is kind of ties into some of the queer themes that I know are very present throughout this film. Almost kind of feels that, James Whale might be able to kind of relate to a scientist in, him being an openly gay artist at the time, and people criticizing the way that you go about things. Cause I think, people can be curious about God, but you can be curious about God in different ways. And so in that way, there's, with him having that line of being oh, this is what it feels like to be God. And it's people would get upset about that because it's not an experience they might be able to get to because they're not open-minded enough, versus, again, being a gay person, it's like, if you open your mind to certain different experiences, you might feel things that other people aren't going to get to feel. And people that aren't willing to open their minds up to that get scared by it. So it's like, I feel like, using the scientific metaphor to kind of bring in some of these like kind of queer themes as well, I find super fascinating.
Well, I mean, I also think, let's be real, censorship is rarely rooted in media literacy. It's usually reactions to, who's the dominant power, what do they believe in, and now kind of what are they going to make everybody else believe in. So certainly you look at this time, I'm not surprised that they're removing lines like this, and I wish that they probably thought about it as hard as we did. They probably just saw a character say that they were on a level playing field with God, and they were like, that's got to go. As far as like the, what's there is, does he reach his comeuppance? I think he absolutely does. I would have preferred him to, actually die. Bride of Frankenstein would have certainly looked a lot different, but I think that I think this movie deserves kind of a warning that is a real, or an ending that is a real warning, this cautionary tale, right? And this tragic ending. I don't think that it needs to be, have this epilogue of showing Victor to be alive. I say kill him, man, but I get it. It's not, it's not the happiest ending in the world.
And there's another moment later on, like before Henry has I keep saying Victor because in the novel it's Victor. In the movie, like, Victor is this milquetoast handsome dude with a mustache that wants to horn in on Henry's lady. Like, he's just there to be good looking and be like, I kind of like you, but you're betrothed to somebody else. Best exchange.
And then he just kind of disappears from the movie.
It just kind of goes like, I wish you wouldn't go. I would go to the ends of earth for you. I wish you wouldn't. I'm fond of you. I wish you were. And then she's like, right, I got to go. It's just very creepy. There's an exchange later on between Henry and Waldman when Henry thinks that he has succeeded. He doesn't quite get the full scope of how low the monster is intellectually yet. And he's kind of like feeling his oats. Like, he's at the table, he's puffing on a cigar, he feels he's succeeded. And he has this like really wonderful speech. And Brian, I'm hoping, like, can you read the quote here from the notes? Because you have a notes of how this was from Whale's contribution.
Yeah.
Like how he contributed this to them.
Yeah, this was his one... well, I mean, obviously he contributed a lot more to the final product, but, this is officially put into the script by James Whale, and this is where Henry says to Waldman, he says, dangerous? Poor old Waldman. Have you ever wanted to do anything that was dangerous? Where should we be if no one tried to find out what lies beyond? Have you never wanted to look beyond the clouds and the stars, or to know what causes the trees to bud? And what changes the darkness into light? But if you talk like that, people call you crazy. Well, if I could discover just one of these things, what eternity is, for example, I wouldn't care if they did think I was crazy.
And I love that speech, and I love Colin Clyde's delivery because there's a hint of madness and defiance in that speech when he delivers it. He delivers it not with like triumphant. He doesn't sound triumphant. He sounds like he is goading Waldman on at that I dare you to call me crazy in this moment. And there is something like beautiful about this idea. Like, if we're not pushing boundaries, if we're not pushing the limits of what we can do, we're going to remain stagnant as a species. We're going to remain stagnant as humans. Why are we not? Why are we so afraid to push these boundaries? And yet this whole story exists to show the inherent danger of what can happen if we push too far, too fast. Like, look what our attempts can lead to.
I was going to say, I mean, I love this monologue. I think it's gorgeous. It's kind of some of the best representations of, I think, not only, I don't think he's trying to goad him. I think this is like, for me, honestly, this is like one of the true moments where we get to see like Henry at his true core in his kind of genuine curiosity about life and about science, and the way he kind of delivers that. It gives me shades of the park bench scene in Men in Black, which is one of my all-time favorite monologues. And in kind of like you said, like in feeling he's trying to like show Walden like why science inspires him in a way. And with that, kind of with that quote again too, again, like I almost can't help but feel like, that Whale, putting this in here himself is, also still kind of relating that to his, life of living as a openly gay artist in the 30s, which was dangerous for him, so it's like, I think that this film not only is talking about the dangers of, pushing scientific exploration too far, but it's also the dangers of when you feel that you can't, where you're going to end up that way. Because if he felt a little bit more encouraged by, what he thought people would think about his scientific experiments, maybe he would have taken his time a little bit more and he would have put more thought into it. But because he had these insecurities about the way that people were going to perceive him as crazy, that's it. He acts a little bit more radical with the experiments.
I will say I don't agree with the assessment that this movie is about the danger of advancing technology or the danger of exploration. Because to me, I think this movie is about the danger of unchecked ambition and the dangers of, okay, you are going to pursue knowledge and you are going to pursue wisdom and scientific exploration and all of those things, but when you discover those things, there's a responsibility to that. It's kind of that story of Prometheus, and to say that like this monologue is the POV of the movie, I think is also not quite how I see the film, because I don't see Henry as this protagonist that I'm supposed to trust. He, again, the same character that says, I know what it's like to feel, to be God. I don't think that we're necessarily supposed to take his word, and as gospel here. Again, this is somebody who is supposed to receive their comeuppance at the end of the film. And I don't really feel like he's getting it at this point. He's not really understanding or taking accountability for what he did. He made this thing and he didn't have the attention to detail and to care to, have that responsibility of, again, being a father and discovery and scientific discovery. And, there's multiple kind of things that I feel are at play here, or just multiple interpretations of the film, right? Devaugh's already mentioned the queer angle of this film. I just think when you have a story about an outcast and you have a story about somebody that society turns against, it's really easy to put yourself at that point of view and relate to this character. I think that's why monsters are so beloved, right? Is because they're kind of a mirror to us, and it's really easy to have that audience surrogate as somebody who feels on the outside of society.
Brian, what say you?
I don't know that I have much more to add. I think everyone has spoken very well about all of this. I think my thought is the responsibility for his creation is the key. I think that's also the key to Shelley's novel. And it's funny because of the opening monologue, he says, he did this without reckoning upon God, which is not really the point. And it sort of lays out the quote-unquote theme of the movie that isn't really the theme of the movie. Because I very much think that Shelley's novel as well is not so much about, hey, you shouldn't, advance science. That's not what she's saying. Instead, she's saying, but there needs to be such a thing as scientific ethics and responsibility. Shelley's novel isn't really interested in, it's not a science fiction novel. It's really a story about how society shapes people. It's really like this almost societal science fiction novel, to where it's way more focused on magic and, not as much of the lightning and sparks of the science of this. It's more fast and loose with the rules, and I think that it's more focused on how this angry mob that develops shapes this monster in a less literal way. Sure.
Brian, what about the idea as well of Henry trying to forge his own path. Because one character we haven't talked about, and he's a bit of like a comic relief in this movie, but Baron von Frankenstein, who at times feels like he's in a different movie.
He does.
But it feels like his presence also informs a lot of Henry's decision making. Like Henry is trying to get out from under his father's shadow, whether he's conscious or unconscious of like these choices he's making.
And there was a line in the same scene where he delivers that monologue where he's talking to Waldman. He says something about, his father, he sort of scoffs at his father, not really caring about anything. And I had never really thought about that before today. And the Baron is also sort of a condescending character. These sequences like
this champagne is wasted on them.
This wine is wasted on him, give the servant champagne. And, he sort of goes to the balcony and talks to the peasantry from on high and says, hey, aren't we generous? We're letting you be a part of our happy day and all this other stuff. But I think that you see Henry wanting to remove himself from that life in a lot of ways. I do think he does in the film love Elizabeth, and that's sort of the one connection to I know, but I think that's the one connection to that could bring him back to the world. Even though he tells her to go away at first, that's because he's so drawn to his obsession, which is like a drug to him. And that I think is explored more in Bride, where it's almost like, he's an addict and he's being coerced to take another hit in the second movie, whereas here he doesn't seem to have much connection to the world outside of his work. So he seems to be much more, Waldman is sort of the go-between that he can relate to, but that's about it.
Waldman, it seems like, is who he aspires to be in some ways. Like, he's a man of learning, he's a self-made man, whereas like Baron von Frankenstein was born into his class and he inherited all his wealth. And there's that scene before the wedding, like 30 years ago, I put this crown of like orange blossoms on your mother's head, and I hope 30 years from now your son will put this on your head. And there's that line like, a son to the house of Frankenstein, and Henry cringes at that because on one hand he actually has delivered a son to the house of Frankenstein, but on another hand he's kind of like cringing against those expectations of having to like
continue
pass down from generation continue this line that really, like, what do they contribute?
Yeah, and I think that goes again to Wales' sort of issues, experiences of class, being born poor, but sort of becoming wealthy of his own accord, and sort of finding this separation between himself and I think there's sort of an inner turmoil between where he came from and who he had become.
And you only have one moment in the movie where a character lets down their guard and lets kind of their feelings about the Baron be known. Like when the Burgermeister leaves after their conversation with the Baron, where the Baron is like completely condescending and rude to the Burgermeister, who's simply trying to say like, look, we've prepared the village. Let us know what we should be doing. Like, is there going to be a wedding or not? And the Baron is completely condescending to him. When he leaves, like for a moment, the Burgermeister turns around, and when his like says goodbye to him, you see the look on his face, and it's one of spite. He's just like, I can't believe I have to deal with this guy and like be nice to him. And the mask quickly goes back up, but I find it like a really telling look, and I love that little that little moment and that little piece of facial acting. I love
Well,
that.
we were talking a bit about how he feels a tad out of touch or out of place in the film. He feels a little awkward, maybe tonally. I really like that. I love that James Whale and a lot of his films, I think, are we talked a lot about it on our podcast, shameless plug time. But when we were discussing a queer cinema, we were talking about its ties to camp and to going to more exaggerated, going to more dramatic. And if you look, every corner of this movie is camp. The performances of this mad scientist, screaming to the heavens and cackling and lightning coming down. It's dramatic. It's far more extravagant than the novel. It's far more extravagant than even earlier German expressionist films. It's kind of this more American version of it, but bringing it to modern audiences in a really different way. I think it's a true reinterpretation of the text, and I don't think that this film gets as much credit as it should for its humor. This is a really funny movie. There's a lot of great jokes in it, and I think Baron Frankenstein is kind of the butt of the joke a lot of the time, of this very well-to-do kind of guy that I think, again, especially considering when this movie came out, people probably didn't really relate to. That he is kind of more aloof cartoon, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to Henry for breaking the mold of being a nepo baby. He, getting out of his goofy dad shadow.
Without Dad's money, though, is he going to be able to have that castle up on the hill and all that equipment?
Prob's not, and that's the problem with the nepos these days. They're not admitting
it's an old abandoned watchtower, though.
Yeah, but to piggyback off of Garrett's kind of camp observations, and to tie into his relationship with Elizabeth, is that kind of where you get a lot of this kind of melodrama between them, and it's fascinating because I feel like he does care for her, but she was kind of a placeholder until his experiments started coming to fruition. And it's okay, now that we're engaged, I should probably tell you about these crazy experiments I'm doing because I'm actually making progress, but you're going to think I'm crazy. It was kind of wild to do right before or right after an engagement. So it's I do feel like he does care, but it also comes down to this kind of interpretation that again he's scared of what the fellow doctors are going to think about his experiments, what the town's going to think.
It's all about ego. And this whole movie is about ego.
and he cares about what Elizabeth thinks too, to a degree. So it's kind of also that angle of a marriage where it's you want to kind of hide some of your dark things about yourself. So it creates a lot of great melodrama between them. I love the moment where she's tell me I'm enough for you. Tell me you love me enough. And he just goes, sure. And it's one of the greatest comedic beats in the movie.
There's also a really funny kind of ironic cut in the film where they cheers to Dr. Frankenstein's son, and then they cut to the monster. It's this really great joke of cheers to his kid, and look what he's doing.
Yep.
Let's talk a little more about Henry and Elizabeth. We've kind of tiptoed around some of the queer undertones, and Bride of Frankenstein is considered one of the touchstones of queer horror cinema for good reason. We'll talk about that a lot more in depth next week. I will say there's a specific moment in that movie when gay cinema and camp cinema is born, and we'll point that out next week. But there are a lot of queer undertones in this movie, specifically with Henry seeming to do anything and everything in his power to get away from Elizabeth whenever he can. He, on his wedding day, literally locks her in a room and gets as far away, pieces out. When he hears that the monster is in the house, the monster's in the house. Let me lock you in this room where you can't get out, and I will go away. Almost he's kind of hoping the monster is going to break into the room and maybe do away. And
I think he's doing it for her protection, but
sure, Brian.
Misguided protection, but her protection.
But in any given, like, Henry is surrounding himself with, like, Fritz and Waldman and the company of men throughout this movie. It's where he feels his most comfortable. Like, he's comfortable around Fritz. Like, Fritz is a friend to him. Like, when Fritz dies, he's like, my poor dear Fritz. Like, he is saddened at the loss of his henchman. I mean, there's a true pathos there. When Elizabeth shows up at his door, his reaction is, oh, go away. Like, that's literally what he says. He does not want to let her in.
It's like she walked in on him naked or something. He's like, no, you can't see me like this.
Yeah. At his lowest moment. And this idea that, like, Henry and Fritz together, like, these two men have created a life without needing a woman to create a life. Like, they've kind of, like, eliminated the need for woman in order to give birth to a son of their own. And I don't think that it gets more queer or queer friendly than that idea. That, like, we can just live our lives in peace. We can have a family. We can build the queer family we want.
I mean,
without the expectation that we're going to need to get married.
I mean, it's also, like, kind of almost progressive in a way if he's, like, because if you do want to believe that he does care for Elizabeth, because I think to a degree he does, it's, like, kind of him being like, hey, I love you as a person, and, yeah, we should totally get married because, you know, society stuff, but, like, hey, if I show you my kinky queer stuff, are you going to judge me? Like, can you still let me kind of have this and, you know, talk about kind of some camp queer cinema iconography. I mean, the scene where he does bring the monster to life. I mean, we see his O-face. He practically orgasms from this rush that he has from bringing it to life, and you kind of see everybody's look in the way that they look at him when he's kind of having this feeling of elation.
He puts on a show. He sets out chairs. Like, he's making a demonstration of it. Like, I think there's just a little production behind it.
So he's like, are you gonna let my freak flag fly or not? You know, so it's like I kind of see it like almost in him kind of wanting to have both lives in an interesting way.
I had forgotten that he didn't create this monster in secret. I had forgotten that he was like, on the day of it coming to life, he's like, oh yeah, let me get out the good silverware. And he's like, let's do this.
To be clear, they come to
they show
him.
up uninvited.
They come uninvited, you know.
But he doesn't postpone it. He's like, all right, well, we're going to do this.
Well, you're here already.
Go away.
At the end of the movie, he has that moment with Victor, and he's like, look, I am entrusting you to take care of Elizabeth. He's essentially saying, I'm releasing my hold on her. Like, I am giving her over to you. Take care of her, love her like I was supposed to love her. You know, he's essentially giving his blessing to Victor, who everybody knows is deeply in love with Elizabeth and is probably a better match for her. Take care of her. You know, that's what he's giving his blessing to that union. So I think there's like a lot of like queerness in this movie that is like very, very, it's very obvious. I think you see a lot more of it in Bride of Frankenstein, but to your point, Devaughn, like James Whale is like, I'm not sure if he was like 100% in the open for 1931.
He was. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I thought it was like an open secret, like he was as open as you could be for the 1930s.
Well,
like it wasn't
the early 1930s in Hollywood. It actually wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't until the Hays Code sort of had to transform all this stuff that things became much more of a deal. I mean, obviously it was a big deal. I mean, don't get me wrong, but Whale. I'm getting some of the things I'm saying from this biography on James Whale. The queerness becomes much more of an issue with Bride because things were becoming more, challenged for him.
By 36, you could not make horror movies.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they were banned in Britain, essentially. Yeah. So, there was sort of a dead period in from 36 to about 39, which, like I said, we'll probably cover more with Son of Frankenstein.
Oh, yeah. it takes like a triple bill. We'll talk more about it,
Yeah.
but it takes like a theater in LA doing a triple bill of horror and like lines around the block for days before studios are saying like, screw the code, we're just going to start doing these movies.
Yeah, that's right.
Again.
Yeah.
Garrett, you wanted to talk about Fritz. What do you have to say about our dear hunchback friend, and played by the wonderful Dwight?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of talk to you guys about it, and it seems like you guys are fans of the book. You probably are familiar that Fritz, not in the book. He was added because of the play initially, and was seemingly more of a plot device, but has since kind of transcended just being that. Like, he is an iconic character in multiple different versions. Big fan of Young Frankenstein, but in this film, does that character work? Does the character work in a way that kind of lives up to the iconography, or do you feel that kind of comes later down the line?
I mean, I said he was an asshole, which is true. He does, take his frustrations out on the monsters so much, and again, for me, that comes back to themes of accountability. Like, yeah, I'm sure Fritz's life isn't the best, and I'm sure he's been put upon in certain degrees, but that doesn't give you the right to act in the way that he does once he gets the opportunity to. So like, is he much better than anyone that might have been doing that to him, even though it seems like him and Henry get along fairly well? So it's like, it is interesting the way Fritz just like kind of fits into the film as far as like the power dynamics go. And with also, linking into some of the queer undertones as well. Like, the only person he ever works with is Fritz. We don't hear about anybody else but Fritz. So it's like, he's an interesting character, but still an asshole.
Devaughn, you don't know what it's like to live life as a short man. That's all I'm saying.
Hey, this is...
poor guy. It's just... I had to go and get stuff yesterday at the store. It was on a very high shelf. It was falling on my head, trying to jump up and get it. It was embarrassing.
Oh, and I bet you thought that Arthur was justified in Joker 2, don't you? It's not justified. It's not okay.
I've not watched Joker.
Oh wow, good for you.
Good for you.
Yeah. Not on my list. Brian, I mean, I know you're a huge fan of Dwight Frye.
Oh, absolutely.
And I believe you love this performance. What do you make of Frye's performance here and what he has?
Frye was great in everything. I mean, he's the best part of Dracula, in my opinion. I like him even more than Lugosi, and I love Lugosi in that movie. But I think he's just what he brings to this. I think the character itself is interesting because it sort of underscores the class idea as well, because he's sort of the bottom rung of society, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's probably a convict. He's disabled. He's got real issues, and he manages to, so when the monster is created, there's someone that's a rung below me. This is new. So I think he takes advantage of that. And I think these caste systems are sort of on full display throughout this movie, and we've already discussed that a little bit. But the iconography of this character, I mean, when we think of Igor, we think of Fritz, Igor is, when he comes along in Son of Frankenstein, is pretty different from this character. So, but hey, when we think of, Young Frankenstein with Igor, if we think of the cartoon movie that came out several years later, it's Fritz that is the template for that. And Dwight Frye's performance here is, he's just always engaging to watch. Yeah. He seems to be having a good time in every movie he makes.
Frye is so good as Renfield that they create this role for him in Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. And he's so good as Fritz that they bring him back for Bride of Frankenstein as a different but similar character. And he's brilliant as that. And then Lugosi as Igor, it's a different take on like the hunchback assistant, but it's equally like I think it's
great.
My favorite Lugosi character. Like he's incredible. Like, they said I killed a man, so they say. I was robbing graves, so they say. It's Lugosi steals the show from Karloff.
Absolutely. I would
Son
agree.
of Frankenstein, which I'm looking forward to. I enjoy Lugosi more in Son of Frankenstein than I do in Dracula. I think he's brilliant. He's born to play Igor more so than even Dracula. So I'm a big fan. And that I don't think that role exists without Frye playing Fritz in Frankenstein.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I really love it. And it does give impetus for Karloff's monster be acting monstrous. And let's shift focus just a little bit to talk about the one scene that Karloff and Whale disagreed about. The scene that was cut from the film for years until it was restored in that VHS that Brian talked about, and it's on the DVD and Blu-ray and 4K now, is the scene where Karloff encounters Maria, the young girl, and it's the first person to show him any sort of kindness, any sort of empathy, any sort of caring. And he rewards her by throwing her in the lake, not out of any sort of animosity or anger or evilness, but because out of a sense of like childhood logic, he logics, I've enjoyed this tossing these beautiful flowers in the lake. The flowers float. They're beautiful. This girl is beautiful. She'll float too. And he accidentally drowns her. This was the one scene that the two disagreed on. Karloff did not want to show it. He felt it was too monstrous. Whale insisted that it goes in. And it probably led directly to the creation of the Screen Actors Guild, because Whale treated Karloff horribly after this. Like after this scene, after the arguments they had on set or the disagreements they had on set about it, the next thing they have to shoot essentially is Karloff carrying Colin Clive like up the hill to the windmill and then up the steps. And Whale won't let Karloff use a dummy. He's like, nope, you got to carry that dead weight over and over and over. And it causes Karloff a permanent back injury. Like he permanently hurts himself, and it led to Karloff becoming a founding member of the Screen Actors Guild and like lobbying for better working conditions.
Absolutely.
Brian, I think you and I like disagree. You're like, you thought the scene could get cut. Well, I think it's no.
I think. Let's talk through what's going on here, though. This is what Whale said. Whale wanted Karloff to pick the girl up over his head and throw her into the lake.
Oh God, I'd love that.
Yeah,
but okay.
Right. Karloff said, wouldn't it be more artistic if we just showed me reaching for her and then you cut, and then the next time you see her, she's being carried by her father. Now, that's essentially what it ended up being for a long time, because the scene exists in the unrestored version. It's just up to the point where he reaches for her is where it cuts. And you can see that in the restored version. If you watch carefully, the images don't quite match. So what was cut out doesn't quite match. So they came to this compromise that he would pick her up and toss her. Yeah. And that's what's in the film. Now, Marilyn Harris, this little girl, is really... I love this story, if you don't mind me sharing this.
Please do. It's a great story.
I just love that Marilyn Harris, the little girl that plays Maria, she had this sort of domineering stage mother. But on this day that they were going to shoot, there was an hour drive out to Sherwood Lake. And so they were all getting in cars, Karloff in full makeup. And she comes up to Karloff and says, I want to ride with you. And is that okay? And he says, well, of course, darling, in that lovely lispy voice of his. And so he has this instant connection. The monster has sort of this instant connection with children that has sort of continued on. I mentioned my own experience with that connection. But one of the stories that's kind of funny is there's something didn't quite work in the first time he tossed her in the lake. She didn't go out far enough.
He didn't throw her far enough. So James Whale. Can I just state for the record before you
go ahead.
Continue? The part on the pendulum, I mean, we haven't put it to a vote. I'm going to vote for the crew. We are very pro throwing children in lakes, okay? That's
very pro fuck them kids. Very pro fuck them kids.
If we are for one thing, we are for throwing small children
unified on
in
this.
Very far. Oh, sorry.
All good. So she had to do it again. And in order to coerce her or get her to do that again, Whale asked her, anything you want, I will give it to you if you do this one more time. And she said, because she was on a strict diet because of this domineering stage mother of hers, she wanted 12 hard-boiled eggs. To which he agreed. And she did it again. And then later she received her reward, which was 24 hard-boiled eggs from James Whale. And I love that story. And I love also, but before that even, just that idea that she just connected instantly with Karlof. Mm-hmm. And Karlof always talked about how the children that he connected with, most of his fan mail came from children. And one of the things that he said, and I love this story, a fan letter that he got, he sort of paraphrased it, and he said, she said something like this: "I always like to see you as the Frankenstein monster, though at home they sometimes tell me it will make me sleep badly at nights. It doesn't." Because the parents were always freaked out, right? It doesn't. If I lie awake thinking about you, I think of what a poor, frightened thing you are, and with all those people chasing you. Besides, you didn't mean to be bad, did you? They made you be. So it seems like these children understood the thematics of this movie and this character more than the adults, because Karlof on set was required to wear a veil over his head so he wouldn't scare the secretaries, according to Carl Laemmle. And he couldn't eat in the studio commissary because he was making people uncomfortable. So it's sort of like the themes of the movie playing out in real life during the shooting of the film. And I think that is just a remarkable kind of story and element to the backstory of this movie.
Yeah. And it's Karlof doing this in... I think you noted here, he's shooting this in the middle of the summer in heavy makeup, in costume.
Over 100 degrees.
And Karlof's a trooper. Like, Karlof never complains.
Right. I mean, I thought you were going to say 12 cookies. I thought you were going to say 12 candy bars, but 12 hard-boiled eggs is hilarious from that story. But, I mean, the scene is so integral to, seeing the, like you said, like you see this interaction that's, the one pure interaction in the whole movie. And if you did the cutaway without watching the toss, one, the toss makes me laugh every time because it does look pretty funny. Two, but if you have the cut in between, you don't have the, to show, it's nothing but 5 seconds after he tosses her in the water that he's already concerned and already realizes like what he did wrong and starts panicking.
That's right.
So if you put a cut in there, you don't really get that, very smooth flow to like see the immediacy of like how quickly he learned that he fucked up.
Well, in a way, it actually makes it worse because it makes the scene worse when you have the cut because he just reaches for her and the next time you see Maria, she's dead. And
and it makes that moment hit harder too because the last thing we see is her getting tossed in the water, and then later on we see her getting carried. It's like, oh man, because then you have to start thinking about like, oh my god, the dad had to fish her out of the lake, and like that kind of whole, and that's like a whole horrific scene unto itself. And then you see, the next time we see her is her corpse being carried. So it just makes it hit even harder.
Yeah, I mean,
so this is
I was just going to say, I can't imagine cutting earlier. Like, your take away everything from that scene. For one, as we established, throwing children in lakes. I want to see that.
I wish there were more kids.
Yes,
more kids.
Just
wish it was like a kids at recess, and he just threw them in. Like, what if I throw them all in, and they'll save each other? And
I do think that Karloff was right to object to him throwing. Lifting her up over his head, though. I think that would be crazy because that's not because the idea is he's just tossing in another flower. Whereas that is like it's malicious. There's an aggressiveness to it, and I think that would undermine the character a little bit.
I don't know. Agreed. I think she could have went through it a little bit more. Struggled just a little bit more. Throw her a little bit harder. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, I think cutting earlier completely changes the characterization of the monster. Devaugh's exactly right. That reaction shot that you get is not only totally integral to his character, but also some of Boris Karloff's best acting in the movie. So, like, why would you want to cut that? I know it's a brutality sort of thing, but you sacrifice so much.
You also get, after this, I think one of Whale's best shots in the film, like one of the best sequences, and you get a real example of how far cinema has come from Dracula to Frankenstein when you have, I believe it's Hans, carrying his daughter through the square. You have like the ringing of the bells, and you have like Hans, like the walk that he gives, that stagger, like that almost like that glassy-eyed look, and the way he's almost lurching like the monster. Like it's a very kind of stiff-legged walk. He's almost off balance, and the fact that like Maria looks dead.
Yeah.
The young Marilyn Harris like does an incredible job of acting dead in that sequence, and they do an incredible job of just little details.
I'm haunted
like
by the
songs.
way her leg bounces in that scene. There's something about that is just so disturbing.
The other detail that gets me is that as he's walking through the square and passes by the revelers, everybody is celebrating the wedding until he walks by, and then they stop. And there's like one person who reacts with like this real visceral shock, and you see it happen almost like dominoes falling, like everyone's celebrating. He walks by and they instantly react in shock and terror and begin following
There's
him.
like a kid that shouts Maria.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, my friend that's my friend. It's like the sound of this little kid's voice.
It's a beautiful sequence. It just shows how much command Whale had in terms of like visual storytelling. This like brief, like minute-long sequence tells such a tale, and it does lead directly to what Brian and Garrett, what you have both talked about with class warfare, because like the villagers aren't angered at Henry and the Frankensteins for creating this creature. They immediately want to go after the creature with, I believe, what might be the first sequence of like villagers with pitchforks and torches in a horror movie. But they immediately turn all of their anger towards the creature, not towards the man that created him and then abandoned him.
Yeah, the scene has like impeccable choreography, because I mean there's a shit ton of extras in that scene. So the way for Whale to be able to like kind of control the flow of that entire scene to kind of show like, in kind of a, almost real time way of, like you said, like, the realization, then, the shifting of the energy that, they already had from, excitement now is, shifted into anger. Halloween Kills could have taken some notes, but I think it is a really nice, interesting transitional scene. Again, like, Whales with a lot of these kind of like longer, held shots, and we get some like kind of tracking, like, the way we see them go from the parade to anger, then you kind of cut, and then they all of a sudden have the torches and stuff. Afterwards, so it's like the way that it flows in this back half of the movement is just like gorgeous.
It's also another.
It's funny you mention Halloween Kills, because I think if you listen really closely, one of the villagers yells, "Evil dies tonight." I'm pretty sure
it's a deep cut. It's a deep cut from David Gordon Green.
Deep cut.
I think it's also kind of another example as to the camp sort of argument with this film, right? This dramatic shift in tones that kind of happens in this film. Like I said, James Whale has a pretty sick, twisted sense of humor. And so I do feel like he's having a bit of fun with the irony of this celebration of a wedding, people celebrating the start of something new being interrupted by the ending of something so young. I think that it's a little, not quite like black humor, but there is a real, disparity between the two.
No, one of the funniest lines of this movie is like whenever they all are like kind of rising up, and then the burgomaster like comes out of the church, from the wedding being interrupted, and he's like, "Oh, she's dead," and then he goes, "But why'd you bring her here?" It's one of the funniest line readings of the entire movie.
I think the real funniest thing that happens when the monster confronts Elizabeth and she screams, he just kind of like that's just
that gets a laugh every time. I've seen it with another people. So I saw this on. You mentioned earlier about how kids or young people, different people of different ages, react to this movie. I took my son to this when he was. This was a couple years ago. He would have been 11, and. He was into this. He was really into this. The three James Whale ones that we saw, this, Invisible Man, and Bride, he was into all of them. They really held up for him. But anyway, that part, just sort of that growl that he gives, always gets a laugh. It never fails.
It's chuckalicious.
I
absolutely chuckalicious.
Yeah, like I had mentioned, I was a huge fan of this when I was a kid. So totally, personal experience here. Yeah, I absolutely think that this has again that timeless quality to it. I'm a sucker for the scene where he starts puffing smoking the cigar. That's like a profile picture waiting to happen. It's just a really funny moment. It's a very human moment too.
And
that's
Bride,
a Bride. Yeah.
Oh, my mistake.
A great little Karlof aside in that scene with Mae Clark. She was like, "Boris, I think I'm going to be terrified when you're in this makeup."
I love this
He's like,
too,
"Well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to wiggle my pinky finger. So when we're acting, just look at my pinky finger and it'll be wiggling and you'll know it's me." And I keep looking for it, like when I'm watching this, to see if he's wiggling his finger, and I can't quite catch it. So it must be like his right hand.
It's his upstage hand. He's doing a pretty good job of concealing it. Yeah.
So it's one of those things he does to keep, because Karloff was just like a very gentle, humane, wonderful human being. Like there's just everybody loved Boris Karloff.
Yes.
Like it's one of those things, or except for Lon Chaney Jr. apparently, but everybody seemed to love it. I don't think Lon Chaney Jr. liked many people,
I think you're
honest.
probably right about
that. So I think he liked Jack and Daniel, and I think that might be the only two people he may have really liked. Talk about the end super quick here, because I think it's again something I just noticed for the first time last night. This overhead shot of the villagers running out, like this gorgeous almost crane shot of like dozens of villagers running out and rushing. Just beautiful command again of Whale. And you have this fight between Victor and Henry, and poor Boris having to carry Colin Clive like dead waiting for him, and again causing Boris like a lifelong back injury. And it's something that like Jack Pierce would talk about on an episode of This Is Your Life. Like Pierce saying like, "You won't talk about it, but I will. Like they never should have made you carry him." And Boris being like, "Shut up, Jack. Like please, let's not air our dirty laundry here, good sir." What some of the shots in this windmill sequence are beautiful. Like when they're peering at each other through like the windmill is just gorgeous. But again, he doesn't throw Henry out of the windmill out of any set of anger. He does it almost like, "This is what you want? Like, if I give you him, will you leave me alone?" All the monster wants to do is to be left alone. "I'll throw him at you, just go away." He's trying to fend them off. He's terrified. When they set the windmill ablaze, he's screaming.
The screaming really
you...
got to me on this viewing.
Yeah.
I hadn't really connected with that, but man, it's
afraid.
so afraid, and you can feel the fear. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is not something you would ever see in a Halloween movie, in a Friday the 13th movie, in a kind of in a Nightmare on Elm Street movie. Like Freddy is afraid of, you do get those sequences where Freddy is afraid sometimes, but you're never sympathetic towards Freddy Krueger. Here, I just don't think you can watch this and not feel sympathetic for Karlof.
Yeah.
In the monster. But then you get that really odd tacked on ending where like Henry's in bed and he's surrounded by like 10 women.
Well,
and
they knew they had a hit on their hands after the Santa Barbara preview, and so they said, okay, we're going to add an ending where he is confirmed to be alive. Well, it's funny, in Bride, they just sort of ignore it.
Right, they try to imply that like him catching the windmill on the way down broke his fall enough, and it's like, I don't know, that still looks like he probably would have bit the dust from it, you know. But yeah, some really iconic shots of like we have like the silhouetted crowd lit by their torches. Coming at these Dutch angles is it's just like really striking within itself. And the scene also, like you said, not only the screams, but like the loudness and intensity of the flames to like kind of really put you like how scared the monster is in this moment, and like kind of like the way that he's experienced it, because they do it with that scene. They also do it with the scene where they're bringing him to life with the thunder. It's like very overwhelming at certain points. So I like the things that they do with the sound design in this scene. Is just it's very intense, and yeah, like you really, this is where Boris like really gets to shine, and like because he's kind of panicking around, so you kind of have the body language, his wailing, and it's heartbreaking.
I think
it's the difference between having an actor and a stuntman. You're getting a real performance. You're getting a real actor. You're getting something that stands almost a century later. It's not been duplicated. It's not just a guy in makeup lurching around.
I will say, I think that this what makes the ending so striking for me, apart from everything that you guys are saying, is that it's a real display of nature. Right, it's showing the power of nature. This big windmill being pushed by the wind. You have the flame of all of the angry mob, kind of with this contrasting of this freak of nature, being terrorized by people. I also love that it kind of takes place with this big giant gear in the center of the room, just kind of like adding movement and loudness and craziness to everything. I don't think that the scene would be quite as tense without it, so I think that's a nice addition.
Yeah, it gives a nice way to separate the two characters and have that like striking visual of them peering at one another, like separated by that huge gear, and that shadow that it creates between them. Like, again, it's Whale creating these like really striking, beautiful visuals that really stick with you.
And there's also a moment too that I know we kind of talked about, like how it would have felt differently if Henry actually did die at the end versus getting to survive, because there's a moment too when the mob is like kind of making their way up to the windmill, and he splits off to like try to get ahead of them to like find the monster first, because it's like, oh, is this the moment where he is having remorse, and he's like like trying to solve the situation, and like if he did die at the end, then it's like that would have hit a little bit harder of him like actually still learning it, but it being too late for him, versus him like kind of having that moment and then getting to survive.
Yeah. Devaughn, I know you got to get running in a minute, so maybe we cut. I think we've covered it. I think we could obviously talk about this movie for like 400 episodes. Like, it's one of the real touchstones of horror, but we're going to cut it there, and we're going to have a lot more to talk about in the coming weeks, Brian, myself, and guests. But before we leave for the night, let's talk about plugs. And Devaughn and Garrett, what do the two of you have coming up for the Spectre Cinema Club in January and beyond? What does 2024 have in store?
You hear me enough. Garrett, you go ahead and tell them about the pod this time.
Yeah, we have a bunch of exciting stuff coming in the new year, including a brand spanking new Patreon, which is really exciting. We have a bunch of cool stuff coming there. We teased a little bit of what you can expect. 2 new shows with a bunch of little extras, in each episode. So I'm really excited about all of that. So you can follow us at Spectre Cinema on Twitter. I, of course, am in Garrett McDowell. You can follow me as such on Twitter, as well as Letterboxd and TikTok. I also have another podcast that is a Star Wars podcast called Scum and Villainy. So if you're interested in that, we have new episodes every Thursday. Twitter is at ScumVillainPod.
Excellent.
And you guys can find me at the usual places at _Daddy Disco across all social media platforms. And yeah, Spectre Cinema Club, January, we are going through Best of 2023 right now. You can hear our Best of list episode, and then we're going to go into our specific favorites. But I'm in the middle of the Pod and Pendulum Best of episode, and I'm loving the overlap and different choices there as well. So yeah, we'll be doing that for the rest of January. Come hang.
I'm looking forward to listening, because I listened to your Saw rankings, and they were total chaos compared to ours. So I'm looking forward to listening to you and Garrett and Zoe and your best of, and hearing how they intersect with one another.
It was very interesting. We all really liked the same stuff, so it was just a bunch of nerds just gushing over what they
definitely
loved
not
share.
as chaotic as either of the Saw ranking episodes.
Excellent. What was a year? I think that there were some very specific standouts. I think that and it seemed like it was a very back-ended year. A lot of the better movies came out at the back end of the year, so I think that made it a little bit easier to kind of do rankings this year. Brian, how about yourself? What do you have coming up? Your eyes just went huge. You're oh.
Yeah, I'll keep this short. So over at Movies for Life, we just dropped our episode that's ranking our favorite films of 2023. Later this month, we're going to release our Discoveries episode, which is always fun. Our 10 favorite movies from any year other than 2023. As for me, I'm just going to plug my series that I'm doing for Manor Vellum called Faces of Frankenstein, and the one that focuses specifically on James Whale's Frankenstein is called Faces of Frankenstein, the Innovation and Influence of James Whale's Frankenstein. And you can find
we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Great.
And you can find that at manorvellum.medium.com and search for Frankenstein. I'm sure you'll find it. Yeah.
I read through a bunch of those in preparation for these episodes, just to know, just to get in, and it's not just the Universal monsters, but the precursors, and also I'm you know what, next year we got to do the Hammer Frankenstein. It's after reading your stuff on that, I'm all right, next year we do the Hammer.
Yeah, I'm in the midst of writing the second part of that particular article.
They are phenomenal reads.
Thank you very much.
Listeners, you know us. You can follow us at Twitter at Pod and Pendulum. You can follow us at Bluesky at Pod and the Pendulum. Follow our new Instagram at Pod and the Pendulum. Follow me around the street corner and tell me you're the creature from It Follows. That would be fun and a nice way to scare me. If you have the means to do so, go ahead and become a patron of the show. Go to patreon.com and Pod and the Pendulum. And for $2 a month, you can get a bonus episode every month and some other goodies. Last month we did Godzilla -1. Last month we did Godzilla -1. Month before that we did Thanksgiving. I kind of want to do the Iron Claw this month. I want to do some non-horror stuff, and you can hear some of us sob like babies and talk about the Iron Claw and the Von Erichs.
Do Zone of Interest too. Do that too.
I don't know if I can do a Holocaust movie, man. I don't know.
It's so good though.
I know. Maybe we'll do a crossover Patreon episode, and if I see it, maybe we'll talk. We'll chat, Garrett. I like to talk to you more about movies. This has been a great talk. If you can't become a patron, but you want to support the show, do us a favor and rate, review, and subscribe to us wherever you get. It's an easy way to support the show. Like, leave us like a 5-star rating and write a few sentences about why you like the show. Helps new listeners find us. And like, I want to say thanks to our listeners. Like, last year we doubled our listeners, and I think that's a huge part to all the co-hosts we have. And I think we had a great year, and I want to do that again this year. And a huge way you can help us get there: review us, rate us, subscribe to us. That helps us tremendously. So this has been a super fun episode. Garrett, thank you so much. Please come back on.
Of course.
You're going to be a welcome guest. Devaughn, thank you for suggesting Garrett for this episode. Brian, could not have done this episode without you, my man.
Well, thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Looking forward to the next 7. Yep. And we'll be back next week with a Bride of Frankenstein. So, toodaloo. It's alive. What's going to be our sign off for Frankenstein? It was like game over. What is it going to be?
You just got to edit in that noise that he makes.
Actually, I have the growl as the timer on my phone.
Bad. Fire. Bad. Drink.
Good. There we go.